Hello everybody, welcome to part 3 of my lectures on poultry behavior and welfare. Chapter 3 is about behavioral systems, so is the third chapter out of the 8 chapters that we will cover. And the behavioral systems, I will talk about 6 behavioral systems. The first one, agonistic behavior and the social structure. I normally would also cover reproductive behavior, but that will be covered by Professor Tuyttens. So the third behavioral system is anything to do with water and feed intake and excretion behavior, then body maintenance and comfort behaviors, and then exploration, fear and play, to end with sleep and resting behavior. So let's start with agonistic behavior and the social structure. Well, agonistic behavior has to do with anything, not only aggression, but also threatening, showing subordinates and things like that. And it's important to have a good knowledge of the social behavior, and even more so with the emergence of alternative non-cage housing systems that allow hens to express a much wider range of behaviors. And it is also important, and in which kind of the importance of a good management of the flock is becoming more important. It's very important if we talk about agonistic behavior and the social behavior of chickens to realize that for a chicken, being in the group means safety, and being isolated from the group is very stressful for the animal. So let's have a look at how domestic animals like the red jungle fowl or the Bankiva fowl, how they behave under semi-natural conditions. Because I told you in the first lecture that there were actually very few studies being conducted on wild populations of red jungle fowl because they were so shy and difficult to study. But what we do have is some populations have been well studied under semi-natural conditions, such as the populations of the San Diego Zoo. And what is seen there in a semi-natural population like the San Diego Zoo is that they form groups and living groups of about 40 to 30 animals that are able to recognize each other. If the group size becomes too big, of more than 100 individuals, that individual recognition becomes impossible. And you can raise the question, why do the animals live in groups and prefer to live in groups? Because it has some disadvantages of living in groups, because you have to compete more with your group mates for resources. There can be also a greater risk for spreads of disease and parasites. As a group, you might also be more visible to possible predators. It must mean that despite these disadvantages of living in groups, that there must be some advantages that are even more important than these disadvantages. And what could be these advantages? They relate to the greater possibility of finding food while living and searching as a group, a greater likelihood of detecting predators, and then also diluting the risk of being predated yourself by having so many flock mates around. You don't have to look for a sexual partner for mates. They are there in your group. You can also aggregate when it's cold, and living in group does not induce so much aggression because they establish a very good pecking order in which it is clear who is dominant over who, so that the conflict situations don't need to be resolved by aggression because they know who is stronger than the other one. Also for raising chicks, living in groups could have benefits. Also for your maintenance of plumage, like allopruning, social preening. And as an individual, you can learn a lot of skills and knowledge by observing others in the group. So what we see in the San Diego Zoo population is that roosters and hens, they share a sleeping tree. But it is a dynamic. The roosters and the hens, they can change groups quite frequently. but there tend to be one dominant rooster. And it's important for a rooster to become dominant at least once during its life, because then you can fertilize most of the eggs. But it's also the dominant rooster that has to take most of the effort in defending the territory. And a dominant rooster will tolerate subordinate roosters until they're young adults. If they become older, they will be chased away to the edge of the territory by the dominant rooster. And what is very obvious and apparent in these semi-natural populations is that the hens, they behave in a group, as a group. And they show 3 levels of grouping behavior. The first, or the most basic level, is what is called social facilitation, in which simply the proximity to other hen facilitates certain behaviors, such as preening. And that is maybe because certain behaviors are less risky in company than when you are performing that behavior on your own, because your companion can be on the lookout for potential predation or other reasons for danger. The second grouping behavior is called allomimetic behavior, or sometimes called contagious behavior or response facilitation. And that is if the behavior of some hens is adopted by others, and it's especially the more dominant hens that are being imitated. And the third type is called synchronization. For example, simultaneous foraging or dust baiting or egg laying, resting and drinking behavior, which is not just a response to circadian rhythms such as night and dark or resting in the morning. It's often these kind of vulnerable behaviors in which individuals are less conspicuous to predators if they copy the behavior of the others in the flock. Because if you show a behavior that is very different from the other animals in the flock, you may attract the attention of a predator. We see also in these semi-natural conditions that they normally form a linear dominance hierarchy, which in poultry is called the pecking order. And a separate pecking order is formed among the males, the cockerels, and amongst the females themselves. And the social status of the hens in their pecking order tends to remain stable over consecutive years. And once it is established, it is very beneficial to the group and the rest of the group, because only subtle forms of threats and submission suffice to resolve conflicts. And it is based on individual recognition, in which the color, the size and the shape of the comb plays a major and a very important role for this individual recognition. Of course, the way hens are often housed in commercial aviaries means that it is no longer possible for them to organize a pecking order, because simply there's too many individuals to be able to recognize each other and to be able to know which individual is higher or lower in the pecking order than yourself. So they have to switch to a kind of totally different type of social structure, in which direct signals are used of weight and comb size instead of based on individual recognition. A bit similar to people behaving in a metro where they don't know each other really, but you don't look for a fight with a guy that's bigger than you. So it's a system that is not based on individual recognition, but based on social tolerance instead of a hierarchy. And that is a nice illustration of the social plasticity of the social structure of laying hens, where they can adapt their social structure according to the circumstances. The social status of the roosters in these semi-natural conditions is not so stable as for the hens. And that is because the rooster is very important if he wants to pass his genes to the next generation, that he tries to become the dominant rooster at least once during its lifetime. And that's why the pecking order in the roosters is less stable than as compared to the hens. And the position of the roosters is in the dominance hierarchy is related to their comb, again the size, the color and the shape of the comb, but also their age, the breed, the size, the color, the weight, the health condition. And one of the reliable indicators of how dominant a rooster is by how frequent it crows. We see also that they will, once in their life, fight vigorously sometimes in order to achieve the top position. And they will do that by truly aggressive behavior, by pecking at each other's head, attacking with their sperms, often aimed at the head, and they will chase each other. So they will form a pecking order only under certain conditions. You only do so when the investment in establishing a pecking order will be beneficial over a long term. So, and that will only occur if the chance of repeated contact with the same individuals is high, so in rather small and stable groups. If they're living in too big a group or they're very dynamic groups, it doesn't seem worth the effort to try to establish a pecking order. So the initial aggression of forming a pecking order is actually an investment in a more peaceful existence later on, in which more kind of spontaneous avoidance prevails to overt aggression. The forming of a pecking order, or once a pecking order has been formed, it means that aggression is no longer triggered all the time when chickens enter each other's personal space, but they rather perceive a very energetic behavior directed at another individual as a threat. The most dominant chickens are not necessarily the most aggressive ones, and most often, if there's continued conflict and aggression between individuals in a flock, it's often between individuals that are very close in the rank, because these are more likely to contest the position. And if there is a pecking order, we tend to see an increase in the risk of aggression the larger the group becomes. So up to 10 to 12 hens together. From a lower group sizes than that, we see lower levels of aggression. But if there's no pecking order because the group is too large, they switch to a socially tolerant system, which has surprisingly little aggression. But then the opposite we see, as group size increases, the level of aggression actually decreases. Perhaps there's simply too many opponents to try to defend any resources. So there's no individual recognition, but they use direct signals. And in large groups, we sometimes see a few what they call pariah hens that are excessively pecked by other animals of the flock, and they skittishly flee from one shelter to another when they dare to approach feed or water lines. You also see that modern breeds of cockerels tend to be less aggressive towards each other than older lines, and possibly that is related by the initial selection during their domestication exactly for cockfighting. And this is an illustration of a study that showed that it's the more dominant ones, the one here, and the highest rank one, that show more crowing behavior compared to the lower ones in the rank. And if the lower one in the rank does dare to crow, it will often be attacked by a more dominant rooster. What has also been known and described in red junglefowl roosters is when they fight, we often see what is called displacement behavior. And that is the observation or a behavior that seems totally irrelevant in a certain context because they were doing something totally different. So during a behavioral pattern, a bit of completely different and seemingly irrelevant behavior is being displayed. For example, they are sexually active and you see there's a sexual urge, but it's temporally blocked and finds expression in a bit of grooming behavior. And in the context of fighting, these displacement behaviors is quite different from those that are winning the conflict, from those that are higher risk of losing the conflict. The winners, they show predominantly ground pecking, intent pecking and head swaying behaviors, whereas losers, they show mostly preening, head shaking and head swaying displacement behaviors. How do we explain displacement behaviors? It is not well understood, but one likely hypothesis for explaining displacement behavior is the disinhibition hypothesis. And this hypothesis states that if there are two strongly activated behavioral urges, such as behavior A, brooding urge, and B, a flight urge, they inhibit each other. But at the same time, by inhibiting each other, they may also cancel the inhibition of another motivation, C, which is normally inhibited by the flight urge. But because B and A inhibit each other, this kind of inhibition of behavior C is no longer inhibited, and that's why it is then expressed, and it is this C that is called this displacement behavior. And what could be the function of that displacement behavior? Well, one hypothesis by McFarland is that it is actually an attempt to divert the attention during a conflict and thereby create opportunities for itself in order to resolve that conflict. So let's turn now to the intake and excretion behavior. And again, let's have a look at semi-natural conditions of the red jungle fowl. So they are omnivorous. They eat seeds, herbs, small invertebrates, also worms, frogs, insects, and so on. And they also eat indigestible materials such as sand and pebbles, because part of it remains in the gizzard, which is functional to grind larger pieces of food. They're also very good at self-selecting their diet that meets their nutritional needs. The vast majority of the daytime, they will spend eating and looking for food by foraging behavior. Even in extensive livestock conditions, that percentage of the time is much lower. The searching for food and eating, it peaks at the beginning and the end of the light period, and it shows social facilitation. It's also behavior that we call contra-free loading. It is important to be able to perform the behavior, and not only the functional outcome of that behavior is important. So they prefer to forage for feed rather than simply consume the same amount of feed from a trough. Performing the behavior is a behavioral need. And why would that be the case? How can we explain that contra-free loading behavior? Is because performing the behavior can be advantageous as well. Because by performing the behavior, by foraging behavior, the animal gets information about its environment, which may come in handy for future. It can also give it positive feedback, because the behavior has a direct impact on the outcome. It gives the animal control over its own situation. But if an animal from time to time or all the time experiences that its own behavior does not have the desired outcome, then the animal may simply try to give up to influence its environment. And then there is a risk of what is called learned helplessness. And that's why some argue that providing an operant feed trough for which the animal has to work in order to access the feed, that could be a good idea for the welfare of the animal, even if they are being fed ad libitum. And that is quite contrary for drinking behavior, in which simply once the physiological need is met, the animals have no need to perform drinking related behavior. So drinking behavior in itself is not so rewarding, is the outcome. Having taken fluids in, that is important. Here you see on the left is kind of the more natural drinking behavior style from an open water source. This is disappearing from most of the livestock production systems in which poultry are being kept, and it is replaced by drinking nipples, which are becoming the dominant drinking system. Although this is the more natural drinking behavior, in which they scoop water and then put their heads up high and let the water fall down or go down their throats. This is becoming less common because there's more spillage of water, by which the litter becomes wet, which is detrimental to their food health. And another risk of these open drinkers is that they defecate in it, and that becomes a more hygiene risk. So the dominant drinker systems all over the world, I think, in at least intensive production systems, are with kind of drinker nipples like this, which is actually quite an unnatural drinking position for a chicken. And there could be two problematic situations, because these drinker lines, as the birds grow, these drinker lines are being put higher and higher. But in every flock, there are individuals with stunted growth that don't grow as fast as the other animals. And for those small chickens, the height of the drinker lines may simply be too high for them to reach. Another problem might be during moments of heat stress, because drinking from high up at the nipple is a behavior that it is difficult to combine with panting behavior. And panting behavior is the natural reaction to heat stress in a chicken. And so especially at times when they need to drink a lot during periods of heat stress, the necessity to pant may not be very compatible with drinking behavior. How we house poultry has a huge effect on the behaviors they can perform. And here you see a difference in the activities they perform on average during a day in a deep litter system versus a cage system with wire mesh. And this was a study with laying hens. And you see that the amount of foraging behavior is much higher in the deep litter system than in the cage system. And in the cage system, they spend more time with actual feeding behavior than in the deep litter system. So the ratio between foraging and feeding behavior is very, very different in a deep litter versus a cage system. Regarding intake behavior, there is 3 motivational phases within intake behavior. The first one is called appetitive behavior, and that goes with affective states such as desire, excitement, and anticipation, and with behaviors such as searching and exploring the area for food. Then there's the actual consumption behavior, which goes associated with prosperity and pleasure when they actually are consuming the food, and the post-consumption phase that gives affective states of satiety, satisfaction, and relaxation. And in this study, which was quite neatly conducted and ingeniously, they housed the hens or the chicks in a housing system like this, in which they could have 3 functional zones that matched each of these different phases, motivational phases. So they had the zone L here, which was a free range area with litter that allowed for foraging behavior. They had a zone F with the actual food troughs for the consumption behavior. And then they had a zone D, a warm and a dark place with a perch, where for the post-consumption behavior. And then they tested what the effects would be of not allowing the animals access to one of the 3 zones, so actually not allowing access for performing appetitive consumption or post-consumption behavior. And then they did a test which is becoming very popular in animal welfare research, which is called the judgment bias test. When what you actually do is that you train the animals to recognize a certain color of a food trough with a negative stimulus and an opposite color with a positive stimulus. And once they have learned that to avoid the dark one and to go towards the white one, you can play around with ambiguous stimuli, in which you don't use a color white or a color black, but you give an ambiguous stimulus like various shades of gray. And then you see, or you look how they interpret the gray. Do they interpret it as white with a positive stimulus, or do they interpret the gray as black, as a negative stimulus? And that is a test of how positive they are, how positive their state of mind is. A bit similar to the idea, do we think our glass is half full or half empty? And if we are pessimistic or depressive, then we think the glass is half empty. If we are more positive, we think the glass is half full. And then they tested what the effect was of being deprived of having access to these different functional zones of their housing compartment. And they've seen one statistically different in the interpretation of an ambiguous stimulus, which was more an optimistic judgment of ambiguity, like the disturbing the appetitive stage, like L, affected the choice less than disturbing either the consummatory or the post-consummatory stages. In this experiment, they tested what the effect would be of providing fewer feeders to the same group of laying hens. So in order to see at what level there's too much feed competition. And so they looked at various behaviors when the feeder space, the centimeters of feeder per hen, was increased from 4 to 10. What they saw is that increasing feeder space did have hardly any effects on feed intake or the feed conversion ratio. So you could argue, well, there's no need to give 10 centimeters of feed per hen. 4 centimeters will do, because the performance of the hens will not be affected. However, big differences were seen when we looked not at performance, but when they looked at the behavior of the animals. Because if the number of centimeters of feed trough per hen was increasing, they observed less aggression, less displacement behavior, more simultaneous eating, and a high duration of eating bounds. But as said before, hardly any effects on the feed conversion. So looking at behavior can give quite different insight than when looking at production performance only. Let's move now to the other behavioral system, the one of body maintenance and comfort behaviors. Included as comfort behaviors are body and tail shaking, beak rubbing, and leg stretching, but also anything to do with keeping their plumage in good condition. And that includes various behaviors such as preening, and that is important, the preening behavior for waterproofing and insulating, also for parasite removal. We don't see a lot of allopreening, so one bird preening another bird. Other behaviors related to keeping the plumage in the good conditions are wing flapping, setting up the feathers, wing stretching, and very important, dust bathing. And dust bathing, the main function are believed to be removing excess fat from the feathers and also removing ectoparasites. I've indicated various of these comfort behaviors with a blue asterisk to indicate that we see much less of these behaviors in battery cages, simply because they don't have enough space for performing these behaviors. So you see them much less frequently than if they have more space than a battery cage provides. But we know that these behaviors have a high motivation. So the birds are highly motivated to be able to perform these behaviors, but they can't. We know that these behaviors are highly motivated, or the birds are highly motivated to perform these behaviors because of the rebound effect. And that is an effect we see that if we deprive them, if we don't allow them to perform this behavior for a certain duration, they will perform more of that behavior afterwards. And that is the rebound effect. And that is an indication that such a behavior is important to the animal. I've also indicated some asterisks in red, and these are kind of behaviors that we see more frequently when conspecifics are nearby, or at least visible to the other hen, because they feel safer performing these behaviors when they are in. Here is an illustration of the daily pattern, kind of an average daily pattern for a laying hen. So very obviously sleeping and roosting at night, and when they get up in the morning, they often start by preening. Then they feed and lay an egg, and then towards the afternoon they like to do a bit of dust bathing if possible, and sunbathing. And this is also the period when feather pecking can become, when this could be more prevalent. So if you're thinking of providing enrichment, for example, to prevent feather pecking, maybe offering it especially at the afternoon could be the more effective. And the dust bathing, as said before, is mainly to do with ectoparasite removal and regulating the plumage of the fat content, which is important for its thermal regulation. Then later on in the afternoon, you'll see mating behavior often. You will see that for the evening, often before they go roosting again and go sleeping at night. Regarding dust bathing behavior, it's an important indicator or behavioral need, in which we typically can differentiate 4 phases. There's the preparation phase, in which the hen puts the feathers up and sits down. And then importantly, the shaking in phase, in which the chicken then repeatedly scratches sand upwards behind itself, so that the sand then falls between the fluffed feathers. That is then often followed by rubbing behavior, in which it lies on its side and turns a little around its longitudinal axis, sometimes with some shaking in between. And then it ends with what is called shaking out, where the chicken stands up, opens its feathers, and shakes the body and wings vigorously. A full dust bathing bout or behavioral bout can easily take and last 30 minutes for the 4 different phases to be completed. And if there's if the circumstances and the substrates are suitable, you will see the full repertoire of these 4 phases of dust bathing behavior. For dust bathing behavior, they prefer a sunny and a sheltered site where the formation of a pit is possible. They prefer also very fine substrates such as sand, some sorts of peat, and the reason they prefer fine substrates is probably because they can penetrate deeper into the feathers and be more functional in this way. They prefer also substrates that have a low fat content, and that might be a problem with, for example, in enriched cages, in which often these kind of astroturf mats are being used to allow dust bathing behavior, and then they are sprinkled with a bit of feed, but the feed often contains a lot of fat. And then that kind of dust bathing behavior may become unsuitable for lipid removal, and then what we see is that the dust bathing behavior is often of much shorter duration, And that can be indicative of frustration. And we either don't see all the 4 phases of the dust bathing behavior, or the dust bathing behavior becomes very short. And then we talk about sham dust bathing behavior instead of proper dust bathing behavior. And this explains why long and complete dust bathing behavior is often mentioned as an indicator of positive welfare. Whereas sham dust bathing behavior often means that there's no suitable substrate for performing the behavior, and that not all the sequences of dust bathing behavior are being expressed, and that the animal is a little bit frustrated because of that. So let's move to another behavioral system, the one of exploration, fear, and play. There's actually not so much known about these behaviors in chickens. We know that, of course, exploration is very important as soon as the chick hatches, and then they start to peck at even small visual stimuli, for example, because they represent something that is edible, like grains, or a moving object that is also could be very interesting, like a small insect for consuming. But a lot of that packing of the newly hatched chick is done with actually a closed beak, so that can't actually consume the thing it is, but it is an important sense, the beak. And a lot of that packing, especially when they're newly hatched, is purely exploratory. And the accuracy by which they learn to peck increases a lot during the first hours after hatching. So it's something they have to learn, and it's something that they do by exploring and by practicing. Let's turn to fear. And the common tests of fear, I have said, is by nature it's a very shy and fearful animal. And so testing fear is very important in behavior and welfare research. And some of the tests that are being used are illustrated here. One test that is used a lot is the tonic immobility test. And that is because when an animal is frightened a lot, it will freeze, or may freeze and turn upside down and play as dead. And it's a kind of a last strategy against predation. If nothing else has worked, you didn't manage to escape from the predator, the last thing you can try is play dead and make the predator think you're not edible, or you may be poisonous. So that is kind of tonic immobility. And then we induce tonic immobility by turning the animal upside down. We pay one hand on its breast, and then it goes into tonic immobility. And the longer it stays in tonic immobility, the more fearful the animal is. Sometimes people also count the number of inductions that are needed to induce tonic immobility, but the main parameter that is being measured is the latency to stand up. Sometimes people also look at vocalizations, but it is an important test for checking housing aspects or human-animal relationships, what effect they have on the level of fearfulness of the animal. It's quite labor-intensive to do a test like tonic immobility, because you need to do every animal after each other, and the tests often last like up to 10 minutes, and so by the time you've done 100 animals, you need a lot of time and manpower. So if you want a quicker test, you can sometimes do a novel object test, which is a test more at group level, in which you place an object that the animals had never seen or experienced before, and you simply look at how long it takes them to approach that novel object. A variation on that is more to test the human-animal relationship, is a human approach test, in which an experimenter, a test person, enters the pen in which the animals are being housed, and you see how long it takes them to approach the person that has entered. Recently, I've come also some reports that say that actually performing a tonic immobility test is actually quite a cruel test and extremely stressful to the birds, just because it's their last possible strategy against predation. So it's something that the birds do when being extremely stressed out. So maybe as a routine test the tonic immobility shouldn't be considered. What about play behavior? Well, play behavior in chickens is typically known as an elastic behavior. And we mean by that that play behavior is displayed more when all other behavioral needs are being met. And if not, we won't see a lot of play behavior. We typically also differentiate the 3 types of play behavior, namely object play, locomotory play, and social play. Locomotory play is often walking with these feathers open. The social play is often mocking and play, fighting, sparring, it's also called. But the play behavior in chickens doesn't seem to be as complex and variable as in many mammals. But there's also a behavior that has not been studied so well in chickens, and it's a behavior that it can also be notoriously difficult to distinguish from other behaviors that may look very similar. And therefore we have to be very careful when we are scoring play behavior, that it really fulfills the 5 requirements that have been written down in order to be categorized as play behavior. And these 5 requirements are that it includes elements that do not contribute to the immediate survival of the animal. It's a spontaneous or rewarding in itself, and the structure or the temporal organization differs from the functional variant of the behavior. It is repeated in various forms throughout at least parts of the ontogeny, and it occurs mostly when the animal is in good health and free of stress. Strangely, providing enrichment has either no or even a reducing effect on play behavior in broilers. There's also been interesting studies being conducted looking at the domesticated breed, the white leghorn in this, with the wild Ancaster, the red jungle fowl, in play behavior. What it shows is that the white leghorn shows more play behavior than the red jungle fowl, and that the development of play behavior is earlier in the white leghorn than it is in the red jungle fowl. But when they then looked at which type of play behavior was shown, it turned out that the difference was mainly due to object play, and that the white leghorn, they showed much more object play than the red jungle fowl. But when we looked at the other behavior types, such as locomotor play and especially social play, then it was actually the reverse, and it was the red jungle fowl that performed more of that play behavior compared to the white leghorn. So the hypothesis explaining this is of course related to domestication effects, in which domestication resulted in an increase of object-oriented play behavior and an earlier development of play behavior. And they also did a further study in which they, within the white leghorn, they subjected them during incubation to 2 different types of hatching situations. The commercial hatching situation, which is thought to be quite stressful to the chicks, or to a calm hatching situation that was supposed to be much less stressful to the animals. And what they saw, a little bit to their surprise and against expectation, that it was actually the chicks from the commercial hatching showed more total play behavior compared to the chicks hatched from a calm condition. And they saw that for object play and also for social play. And that was against expectation, but a possible explanation was that maybe the early stress during hatching made the chicks more tolerant to stress from being relocated later on, and therefore allowed them to play more. So let's now turn to sleep and resting behavior. So what you see here is a typical sleeping behavior of a hen, often with the beak tucked in between the feathers, and this is believed to be a strategy against heat loss and cooling down during the night, and that it's supported by observation then we see more of this head tucking between the feathers during cold nights than during warm nights. You often also see hens kind of dozing like this, in which the head is not tucked into the feathers, with the eyelids they can be a little bit open, and that is more the dozing behavior that have been described. At nighttime, the majority of three-thirds of the time is spent with actual sleep, in which the eyelids are closed. About 19% is called passive, when the animal are motionless but with at least one eye open, and 6 or 7% of the time the animals are active. They also show REM sleep, so dream sleep, and when they do REM sleep, it's always with both eyelids that are closed. But we don't see the same kind of full muscle relaxation during REM sleep as we see in mammals. It seems that the eyelids are actually not necessarily closed when a chicken sleeps. And that is similar to, for example, rats are also able to sleep with their eyes open. And well, what we also see in chickens is what is called hemispheric dissociation. They can actually seem to be able to sleep with one hemisphere, whereas the other hemisphere is actually awake. And then you see that the eye contralateral to the hemisphere that is sleeping being closed, whereas the eye contralateral to the awake hemisphere being open. And that seems to be a strategy to let your brain rest and still be vigilant for danger. And that hypothesis is confirmed by studies in ducks, in which they see when you increase the predation risk in the environment, they show more of this one-eyed sleep when there is little predation risk. Also see when you deprive chickens for sleep for a long duration, such as 14 hours, they will show more of this sleeping with both eyes closed, whereas you will see less of the one-eyed sleep when they have been deprived for a long time of sleep. Of course, very important is information about their sleeping patterns and their resting behavior when we think about developing proper lighting regimes for in stables. And the EU legislation for broiler chickens states that the daytime period can be maximum 18 hours per day, except for the first 7 days and the last 3 days of a broiler's life, in which a continuous lighting schedule of 24 hours of light is allowed. Despite this regulation we have in the EU, there's still concerns about birds being deprived of sleep, of sleep being too fragmented, because sleep has very important functions and multiple functions, of which not all are fully understood, but we know that good sleep is important not only to ourselves, but also to birds. And then you see behavioral disruption and frustration and reduced welfare if their sleep has been deprived, fragmented, or disturbed. So what you typically see in the evening, they seek their familiar resting place, and they have a preference for the higher places, because the higher they go up, the safer they feel from predators. And that's what we also see in the Bankiva fowl. As night progresses, you see less dozing behavior and more actual proper sleeping behavior. That could be an indicator that as night progresses, they get into deeper and deeper sleep, or it could also be an effect of thermoregulation. As the animal gets colder during the progress of the night, they have a higher need to put their head with their comb, which is very temperature sensitive, deeper in between their feathers. We see that in that resting behavior before they go and roost at night, it's often preceded and followed by loads of pecking behavior, in which we think that the higher ranking animals, they really claim the best places for roosting. We also know that in commercial stables, that broiler chickens prefer to rest close to the walls and the corners of the stable, and especially so when stocking densities are high. We think that the reason they do that is in order to be not disturbed or as little disturbed by other animals, by at least having from one side of the barn from which they cannot be disturbed. So during daytime they perch, and that gives them often a favorable position to survey their surroundings, and that could also be a position from which they can be free from disturbance or aggression from other hens. But they use perches a lot for sleeping, both during the day and nighttime, because they feel safe from predators. And you see that the perch use in the red jungle fowl is higher than for commercial laying hens, and the perching behavior is more synchronized. We see also that the use of perches is greater in smaller groups than in larger groups of hens, and the vast majority will seek to perch and to roost on a perch when it's getting darker. So it's very important that sufficient perches are being provided for every animal in the group, because perching is a behavioral need. So they have a very high motivation for perching, and that has been shown by motivation tests, and if you provide perches, it is used a lot. By indications of frustration, if access to a perch is denied, and it seems rather that they have a need to roost somewhere high rather than clamping something with their toes. That seems to be the perching need. But they have a large tolerance for different shapes and thicknesses of perches. And if perches are present, we typically see less aggression in the group, less fear, and less pecking problems. But there is a downside. We also see that if perches are present, we tend to see a higher incidence of keelbone fractures and keelbone deformities. Some people think that perching is not important for broiler chickens, and much less important for broiler chickens than for laying hens, because if a perch is provided, a broiler chicken uses it much less than a laying hen does. But it's rather a physical inability due to its heavy weight, and especially the heavy breast muscles of a broiler, by which it's not physically able anymore to keep balance on a narrow perch. But also in broilers, perching behavior is a highly motivated behavior, a behavior that is learned when they are between 2 to 6 weeks old, and the perch use is high at 4 weeks of age, less before that age, and then after 4 weeks it decreases again because they become too heavy and it becomes too difficult to keep balance. It's important also for broilers to be able to perch in order to flee disturbance and aggression from other hens. But because they're so heavy and they grow so fast, we know that actually a platform is much more suitable to accommodate their perching need than an actual narrow perch. And if a platform is provided that allows them to go higher when they want to roost, they are used much more, and they rest for longer periods and are being disturbed by less. Some have even investigated cooling perches against heat stress. And then research has shown that the use of these cooling perches increases when the broilers age and need to dissipate more heat. And then it improves also their food health and performance. And here's some research that we have done on perching behavior in broiler chickens, because we think perching is also for broiler chickens a natural behavior. And it has been shown in the literature that allowing platforms, elevated platforms, or giving them to broilers has several benefits. It reduces their level of fearfulness, increases their activity level. It reduces the amount of contact they make with wet litter. It improves thereby their food health, and they tend to have a cleaner plumage when they're being provided with platforms. So in a recent research project, we tried to add several functionalities to a normal elevated platform. And these functionalities were aimed to increase the welfare benefit of the platform, but also to improve the litter quality and to reduce ammonia emissions. And here you see an early prototype of these what we call multifunctional platforms, in which one functionality is a cooling system. So there's actually a water circulation here on the top pipes of the platform, in which we can condition the temperature of the water that goes through it, that could either allow heating or cooling. And we know that chickens can thermoregulate via their food pads, so it could be a local way of allowing for thermoregulatory behavior. The area underneath the platform is made dark and warmer and is sheltered by flaps that mimics a little bit a dark brooder under the platform. And that represents a little bit the typical brooding behavior by the mother hen, in which she keeps her chicks under her body, under her wings, and for the chicks that's a safe and warm place to hide. And it's a place where if they want to be passive, they can go there. If they want to be active, they can go outside. Such a dark brooder here, an artificial dark brooder, is something that can simulate a little bit of that typical maternal behavior in a kind of intensive farming environment. And a third functionality on these platforms is manure collection. Here it is with trays that are underneath the platform, so that all fecal deposits from birds on top of the platform doesn't fall onto the litter, but is collected via trays. With a commercial application, it's meant that it's on a conveyor belt, so that the droppings and the manure is immediately brought out of the stable, so that it doesn't form ammonia emissions, and it prevents also the quality of the litter deteriorating too fast. This is an ethogram that has been developed, in which a combination of behavior and EEG recordings are being used, that kind of implanted on top of the head of the chicken in order to do sleep research. And by combining EEG recordings with behavior, we can define the different stages of sleep probably better than if we had only information from one source only. And then we differentiate awake behavior from resting behavior, and sleep behavior that is either slow wave sleep or the rapid eye movement sleep. And then when we use these tools, we can start investigating what effects are of sleep disturbance. And in the first study, what we did is we looked at the effect of repeated short sleep disturbances of laying hens. And these disturbances were applied from 9 o'clock in the evening till 3 o'clock in the morning, and it could consist of wind being blown towards them, loud noise, or light being switched on for 5 minutes, and that happened for every 30 minutes during this period between 9 o'clock in the evening and 3 o'clock in the morning. And then we looked at nights where the disturbance actually took place in red, during the nights afterwards, the recovery night, or the night before, which is the undisturbed night. And you can see that the actual sleep disturbance was effective, because during disturbed nights between 9 and 3 o'clock in the morning, they were more likely to be awake. They showed less short wave sleep and also less REM sleep. But what we didn't see was a change between the green and the blue line, indicating that there was no carryover effect of the sleep disturbance into the following day or night. The importance seemed to be that after 3 o'clock, they could compensate by the disturbances before or earlier that night. So we can see an increase in REM sleep during the hours when in the morning or the late hours of the time, when there was no disturbance anymore. They compensated during the same night in more REM sleep and more shortwave sleep and less wakefulness. So as long as they, during the same night, can recover from short-term disturbances, you will not see carryover effect into the following night or day. In this experiment, we looked at longer-term stressors on sleep disturbance. And the longer-term stressors lasted for 24 hours, and they could either be feed deprivation, heat stress, or we simulated the foot pad pain by injecting a substance into the foot pad. And then we looked at the different, the three different sleep states here, when during the dark periods and during the light periods. And what you can see was that especially heat stress had a very big effect on the different sleep stages during the nighttime, with the animals being much more likely to be awake, showing less slow wave sleep and almost no REM sleep at all. Also, the foot pad pain did have an effect, but it was much smaller than the heat stress effect. And it was only the foot pad pain that also had an effect during the light sun periods. So pain, and especially heat stress, do affect sleep, and we don't know yet what the consequences are or could be of such long-term sleep deprivation.